And now we have Ula Janik, and she's the Senior Agreement Specialist. She's from Region 1. And then we have Justin Shoemaker, and he is a fellow TPM from Region 3. Take it away.
Hello. Hello. So I don't have to stand at the lectern. Great. Hi. As she said, I'm Ula Janik. I come up from Region 1. Justin Shoemaker used to work at Region 1. He's now at Region 3. So I'll be doing most of the talking today. But Justin is here to chime in with information that's more practical, since he was an LAL up at Region 1 for a long time. But I'll be doing most of the talking. We'll have some time for Q&A kind of during the presentation and also at the end. So if you think of something, write it down and ask me. And so today, for about the next 20, 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about what's widely regarded as the coolest and most fun part of project delivery, which is doing intergovernmental agreements. Some of you may not have had the fun of working with your agreements team, but you probably will be if you haven't already. So we're going to talk about, first, of course, the basics. Intergovernmental agreements, as John just mentioned, are just an agreement between us and any other kind of government agency, city, county, district. So when will you need one in project delivery? So if you have a completely ODOT facility and it's all ODOT delivered, let's say you're paving I-5, that's it, you're probably not going to need an agreement. If you have anything outside of that, so it's not completely an ODOT facility or it's not completely ODOT delivered, 9 times out of 10 you probably will need an agreement. Also, if funds are moving between agencies, then you'll also need an agreement for that to kind of facilitate any transfers of funds. So what are you going to need to know before starting, before kind of coming to us? The 2 big things that really drive your agreement. So we get our templates. We all have templates for various types of agreements that come from OPO. So we don't have to start from scratch. We have different templates that kind of all have our general provisions that'll cover us all for like risk indemnification, things like that. But they're all kind of modeled based on kind of project delivery. And the 2 big things are who's delivering the project. So is it ODOT delivering the project or is it a local agency? And what's the money? Is it federal? That's a big thing if we get federal. Is it state? Is it local funds? Is it a mix of all of those? Doesn't really matter. We can handle all of those, but we just need to know what type of money is that. So you have those 2 big things: who's delivering the project, what's the budget, and then what's your scope. So here I've listed that to check the STIP. So we'll talk about this a little bit, but agreements in the STIP are pretty closely tied. And so you want to make sure that whatever you have in the STIP, the finances and that scope, that's what we're going to be looking at as well for the agreement. And so when we talk about scope, the agreements typically come in after scoping but before design. So it's going to be in between there. So when we're looking for the scope, we're not looking for every tiny detail of your project. Design hasn't started yet, so you're not going to know everything, every exact footprint, all of the things, all of the details. What we are looking for, though, is kind of that STIP level scope. So you've got sidewalks, you're doing paving, curb ramps, kind of those big, definable, tangible things that you could point to and say, yeah, this is what our project's doing. What we don't want is kind of this detailed, prescriptive, this is how many feet we're going to do, and this is the width of this multi-use path. Because we risk really pigeonholing ourselves that if some changes come up during design, we have to amend the agreement. And we're going to talk about amendments, but we typically like to minimize them. It's rare that we can get through a whole project without doing an agreement amendment, but that's one thing we really want to think about is drafting a scope for our project that is specific enough that you could point to what it is, but also not so detailed that you get stuck in these very detailed projects. And so your most common templates that you'll see, the top 3 there are tied to federal funding specifically. So we've got certified agency delivery. So if you have a federal aid project that is certified, that a local agency that has been certified through ODOT's certification program, which you'll hear more about later, so I won't go into detail, they have their types of agreements. So they have their agreements that we use. If you have a federally funded project, but it's for a local agency that isn't certified, we have plenty of those across the state. ODOT, as the steward of federal funds, will deliver that project for them, meaning we'll hire the consultant, we'll hire the contractor. The federal money goes through us. We have a template for that, for state delivered. And then even though it says state-funded local program, that program is actually tied to federal projects. And someone's probably talked about this already with you, so I'm not going to go like super into detail about it. But basically, SFLP has criteria for certain federal aid projects of a certain size and a certain location that would be eligible for exchanging those for state funds that would then go to the local agency that then they could deliver it themselves. And so that's one type of agreement. And then this last one is our intergovernmental. So this is kind of our generic, that's actually the name of the template is intergovernmental. And it's kind of the template that we use for most of the other things that we need in project delivery. So for example, we have an ODOT deliver project. You've got your I-5 paving project, and you're working on a ramp, and the ramp ends at a county road. And that county asks us, hey, we were going to do some work there, but if you're going to be there, can you do this work for us? We'll pay for it. Work together. It's collaboration. It's good use of taxpayer money. We say, great, that's fine. We'll need an agreement for that. So for that, we'll need the scope of what is this local agency asking us to do exactly, making sure that they're going to be paying us for it appropriately and at the right times. Maintenance responsibilities, we'll want those to be really clear so we're not left with a facility that's not a state facility that somehow we don't want to maintain. Timelines there for completion, things like that. So for those, we'll definitely want, they're a little bit more flexible. So those could be a lot more back and forth. There's always room for negotiation. But these are the type of projects where if we have a big overlap of state and local facilities, where we have a state project with a lot of local impacts. Maybe we will want to coordinate with them more. Maybe we want to have an agreement that lays out how we're going to coordinate, who's going to be responsible for what, exchanging money for services, if we're going to pay them for design review, if they'll pay us for design review. We can lay that out in an intergovernmental agreement. And so that is kind of our umbrella for the other non-federal aid projects. Not to say that we don't have IGAs for federal projects that are, for example, state projects, but if it's a federal aid project, typically you'll see those top three. And then the IGAs, the generic one you'll see for other types of project delivery projects. And I know at least at Region 1, we've had a huge uptick in those lately with just a lot of money coming in, local money coming in, HB 2017 money coming in, that we're just having a lot of overlap. And so we're just working a lot closer with some of our locals on our big projects, and even not even the Rose Quarters, but even some of our other ones. We have a big uptick in those. And one quick thing, as maybe you noticed, we've talked about scope and budget, but we haven't talked about schedule. So scope, schedule, budget tends to be the big three prongs of project delivery. But for most of our agreements, we actually don't put in the schedule of the project. So for our federal aid agreements, we don't put in every phase and when it's going to be obligated, or when does right-of-way need to be done by, when does design need to be done by. Our typical agreements have a 10-year term. So from execution, it's just a 10-year term. Federal guidelines actually give you more time than that, but for the agreement itself, it's just 10 years. This might change a little bit, I don't know, but with incentivizing obligation targets in the future, maybe we'll want to put something about schedules, but for now we don't say, right-of-way has to obligate in 2022. And this actually is great because slips happen, and we don't want to have to amend an agreement every single time. Normal project delivery occurs, things that are within that bound. For our generic IGAs, we do typically, we can have shorter terms. It doesn't have to be 10 years. We can do 5 years. If it's there's a significant time that we're asking a city to do something, and they really need to do it by this time, or vice versa. Cities like, if you don't get this done by now, then we can have those timelines in there. It's all flexible. We put them in there. But we also end up having to do an amendment for, let's say, if you thought a project would be 3 years, and it ends up going 5, we'll need to amend the term of that agreement. So schedule is not something that we really need that much about agreements. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail on like the process and starting this, the whole thing. But does anyone have any questions right now, right as I'm at the end of my basics spiel? No. Okay. So John posted up the agreements timeline as well, so I'm not going to go too into depth about it. But there is on the intranet site an agreements page, and it has the agreement request form, which we'll look at in a second, and our contact info and this little timeline. So basically the process, so from when you know you need an agreement and then we get it started, is we work with you on that initial draft. We'll go back and forth on that, hopefully only like once. Depending on how much information we get at the beginning, then we don't need as much back and forth with you, the project manager. Then we send it through local review. Make sure, because the locals typically usually have an attorney look at it, they have someone look at it. And then we have a final review down in Salem, which is our finance section. The program section, active transportation, sometimes looks at it. If there's a signal, the traffic engineer will look at it. And DOJ. So any project over $150,000 has legal sufficiency review, it's required. So we get that kind of review done, everyone signs off on it. Some regions, and sometimes we do this too in Region 1, but we'll get that final review first before they send it to a local to look at. We have some locals that typically almost always have some little comments they want to add and revisions they want to add. So in order for me to save myself one back and forth with the final, I get back what the local and ODOT want and then send that. Sometimes there's changes through DOJ. Sometimes there's more updates from active transportation. Sometimes there's ADA updates. That happens a lot. So ADA language is in every single agreement. And as some of you maybe have experienced, it's been kind of updated. It's been kind of a living thing. And so they'll make some changes to the ADA language or things like that. And then once that's finalized, we send it back out to the local and start the signature process. And that can take anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, who knows? So we'll talk about that. But that's basically the process, is getting us all to a place where we are all happy with it. And so let's look at the agreement request form. So this actually just rolled out earlier this year. Region 1's had something like this forever. And it turns out some regions didn't have this, some kind of form where you're able to just put down all the information that you know that you need to give to us. And the more information we get at the beginning, the better our agreement's going to be from the start. And so basically, it really prompts, it's just 2 pages, and you just fill out what's relevant. And the prompts are really kind of what we talked about. What's the scope? Who's delivering it? Where's the money coming from? A full half of our first page is the money. Is it federal aid? What's the match? Is it state? Where's it coming from? Is it local? Or the other, the money is really important for IGAs. And then the scope at the top. The next page is really asks about right-of-way, because sometimes that might trigger another right-of-way services agreement, which is another agreement you might need. We look at ADA and the contact. And we also ask for maps as exhibits, because having that visual really helps everyone in the future and even now, know really quickly, what project is this? Mile points don't really help most people. We don't know where those are. So we like to have a map for that. And so here, and it also checks if you have a new agreement or an amendment. And so we would use this form as well for amendments. So the agreement request form would come in. So if you have a federal aid project, it's probably going to come in as soon as you know you need one. You can ask for an agreement, basically. And so for federal aid projects, if you need an IGA for a local project, for example, because we're getting a match, you have to have that agreement executed before you can go to obligation. So you can't obligate your PE funds until you have an agreement. For other kind of projects that are maybe ODOT delivered that we talked about, our coordination IGAs, basically as soon as you know you need one, ask us, because and we'll talk about timelines and delays in a second, but sometimes they can take up like 2 years. Like even simple ones, we think that no problem, but there's a lot of different factors that go into how long these take, and some of those are out of our control. And so you might as well just start as early as possible. That way, if you get done early, no harm. And then we can kind of build in some time for when delays happen. So amendments. So we kind of treat these the same as agreements. They're a little shorter than our agreements, but what triggers amendments? Typically, again, scope and budget are kind of the big things that will trigger an amendment. So for funding, an increase in federal funding, always an agreement amendment. Increase in state funding as well. An increase in local funding does not automatically trigger an agreement amendment, because we typically, if it's a typical federal aid project with a local, we already say that they're on the hook for overruns. Anything over their match, anything non-participating, anything over the total project cost, it's already in there. So if we have $1 million project, it comes in at 200,000 over, and this local said, yeah, that's fine, we'll cover that. No need for an agreement amendment, we're fine. If we're covering that 200,000 with 180,000 of federal funds, then you'll definitely need an amendment, and it'll need to be executed before you can obligate that extra 180,000. So that's the big budget one, any kind of changes in that. And for state, it kind of is the same. We want to have a signed agreement before we will give more state funds. For the scope, this goes back to kind of how we draft our scope. If we've drafted in a way that there weren't huge changes, just kind of the regular tweaks that happen during design, that's fine. We don't need an agreement amendment. But if you'll have to look at the scope if you know you have a scope change. If it's changing so much that you need to do a STIP amendment, it's very different. You've cut out a whole intersection. For arts projects, I've noticed there are a lot of very specific improvements that we have in agreements for arts funding, and so we typically have to do an amendment when some of those improvements are taken out. So that, if you have a scope change, you could always check with us if you're not sure if you need an agreement amendment, and we can kind of look at how we drafted the original and what that entails. And with schedule, again, since we don't typically have our schedule, those typically don't trigger agreement amendments. So if you're slipping a phase, you thought you were going to do right away 21, it's going to go 22, doesn't matter to me. Don't need an agreement amendment for that. If you're coming up on the end of your agreement term, which has totally happened, where you're 9 years into a project or somehow, and we get that notice that that agreement is expiring, then you will need to amend that agreement to extend the term of the agreement to give you more time to finish. That's rare these days, but we've definitely had them before. For our kind of other IGAs, our kind of umbrella other IGAs, typically those timelines are a little shorter, but again, that schedule doesn't usually come in there, and so we try to give ourselves what we think it's going to take plus a year or two. But we get automatic notices from ORPN when they're like 6 months from expiring. So typically we can catch those and get your agreement extended. That's not a very hard process. And so tied in with stipend amendments, I wanted to kind of just bring this up just to, in your minds, to connect the stipend agreements, because if you were doing a stipend amendment, just so you think, do I need an agreement amendment with this, possibly? And if you're doing an agreement amendment, have you talked to your STIP coordinator if you need to do a STIP amendment? Because those have their own timeline. And we work very closely together, very parallel, but we can't send an agreement out for signature, for example, if the finances don't match the STIP. So if you're doing a STIP amendment to update the finances, we have to wait for that to be approved in the STIP before we'll send out your agreement for signature. So we can be working on it. You know, if we know that you put in your STIP amendment, it's pending approval even, they'll say, okay, you know, Amanda will look at it and say, yep, this looks good, but let's hold off until it's approved. Then no problem, we'll just sit on it. We'll wait to send it out for signatures until then. So we could get all the way there, and then we'll send it out once that's done. Slipping phases, again, like I mentioned, doesn't require an agreement amendment, but would require a STIP amendment. So those are our big amendment reasons. So examples of delay. We're all Judge Judy sometimes. We want our stuff quickly. So some of the big reasons for delay, I've been hearing this since I've been at ODOT about agreements, and they take so long. And sometimes they're just things we can't control. Big examples of delay are switching between project delivery methods, and by that I mean who's delivering it. So if we started as a certified and then we switched to SFLP, we started as SFLP, but now ODOT's going to deliver it. Any of those big changes are going to basically be for us starting over. If you already have an execute agreement, that's a brand new agreement. We just terminate that first one and do a new one. So, getting some of that stuff kind of settled early will help that process. But I mean, this happens, and it's okay. But as far as we're concerned, it's basically just starting. We have to grab a new template and start over from there. The scope changes. By that I mean kind of what can happen between scoping and when you get your project and you look at it and realize, well, maybe we don't have enough money to do all of these things that we thought we could do. And so until that's settled, or maybe if we're rebundling or bundling projects because there are a high number of small cost improvements that then we're going to try and bundle together so we can have one bigger project that's going to be a better, efficient bid. That all has to be worked out before you can get an agreement. And so we've oftentimes started an agreement, and then as we get into it, realize that there's a couple delivery questions. Are we really sure we can do this full scope with what we have? Do we maybe need more money? Why isn't the city delivering that? So that's not really an agreements issue, but we're usually already involved at that point. And so we're trying to drive that, like, hey, do you have that scope? Do you have that budget? Those kind of issues that come up just cause a delay because we just can't really push it out the door until those things have kind of been settled. If you haven't allocated for your right-of-way phase or your other phase or utilities, that'll usually mean you have to go to the STIP and add that phase and add more money, so that's an amendment to your agreement. So those are kind of those scope issues. Special project-specific negotiated terms. So anything that's kind of not in our template and it's kind of new will all have to be approved by the various Salem sections. DOJ, Finance, everyone is going to look at that. But sometimes, especially with our IGAs, our kind of non-federal aid projects, the whole point of them is that we want to have some flexibility in how we work with our local partners, and so we've negotiated these terms and figured out what we want to do. But sometimes the agreement process will bring up some of those issues, and so making sure we resolve them can take some time, and that's totally fine. But the earlier we know that you're going to want some kind of special or just project-specific provisions, then we're going to want to make sure that DOJ is okay with those. We'll send those down to DOJ like way early in the process. I've sent down things for preliminary review for DOJ like at the first or second draft stage, just to kind of get ahead of any issues. We don't want to wait till the end and then suddenly DOJ says, oh, we can't do that, or we can't do it this way. It's usually what they say, we can't do it this way. So the earlier we know those, the better we can kind of avoid later, like the final review questions. And then the biggest delay that is kind of out of our hands is local processes. So every local has their own process of doing their reviews and their legal reviews and their council signatures, getting on agendas, that can take anywhere from 2 weeks to like 3+ months. So we have our biggest local agency, City of Portland, has to get their agreements on agenda a month in advance, and then once they sign it, they have to hold it for another month for public notice. And that's if everything beautifully works out like on time. And so for them, we don't even expect to see it under 3 months from the time we send it out for their signatures to get it back to us with a signature on it. So that's definitely something to think about. A lot of locals have shorter times, but sometimes they'll have canceled meetings. You just never know. Sometimes they won't answer your emails for a while. Then what do you do? So it's just something to keep in mind, and why you always want to put your request in as early as possible, because you never know what's going to trip you up. And I wanted to leave 5 minutes for Q&As, and I already know what David's question is, but I'll let him ask it because I didn't get around to getting it, to answering it.
So Ula, you talked about IGAs. Can you explain the difference between an IGA and a MOU or a letter of agreement?
Yes. So MOUs, we're seeing a little bit more of these coming, at least in our region. That in projects we have a lot of close coordination, where we kind of want to establish where everyone's head is at a certain time. Or like, we all want this to work in this process. We can do an MOU, it's a memorandum of understanding, which is non-legally binding, and just lays out where we are. They're really quick, they're really easy. They can really help guide the parties moving forward in a process of how they want to how to resolve issues. If you're going to have a lot of design questions, like this is how we're going to resolve them. This is how, you can kind of have them for anything. Kind of, we're intending to do X. We're intending to search for funds for this project. We're intending that if we get funds, we'll get it. So in the future, we could always point to that and say, this is what we're all on the same page at this time. They aren't legally binding, so nothing about it, you can't take someone and say, well, you said you wanted to do this back in 2015, and we'd be like, yeah, we did, but things change. So they definitely have a good utility, but just remember that's limited because we're not holding anyone to what they say in those. So they're good though. If you need them, they're quick. No DOJ review. Region management can sign it. Anyone who needs one, we can help you make sure you don't accidentally write yourself into an agreement. So, Justin.
Just a quick comment about MOUs. Depending on who you're dealing with, granted ODOT it may be quick, on their end it may not be.
Yeah. Again, local processes are out of our hands. We can only do so much. Masti. Oh, did you get your mic?
Project IGA says estimated total project cost. If the project cost increases, but that increase is strictly federal dollars, do we need to amend the IGA to show the total project cost has increased?
If it's increased federal, definitely.
But if it's strictly local agency?
Oh, no,
additional.
not at all, no. Not if that's your only thing. So that's usually not that common that it's the only thing that's changed. But if you have $1 million, and it goes up 100,000 and it's all local, no amendment, no agreement change. That's fine. The total project cost is estimated in the agreement, though. So in the future, if let's say you need an amendment for another reason, then we will match that, whatever total project cost estimate is in the STIP at the time. We will go ahead and update that at that point, but that won't be the driving reason for an amendment. We will update it though, because again, our agreements match the STIP at all times. So, and one quick thing, if I have 1 minute, that I wanted to mention. For when we get our signatures at ODOT, we have the executing signature, which is up to $500,000 projects, region management can do it. Over $500,000, it's highway division administrator. And then below that, we have recommended approval. And so those are where the programs that are impacted will sign it. So certification manager will sign all certified supplementals. State traffic engineer signs all projects with signals, illumination on a highway. If there's certain programs where that money is coming from, they'll recommend approval, because then that gives the executing signer, like, okay, we're all good. Lets us make sure that everyone at ODOT that should know about it knows about this. And that's just recommending approval. That's not legally binding signatures. Only the executing one really executes it. But we do, in the agreement section, have processes where we involve various management, lower levels of region management, to make sure that no one's blindsided when they get these things. So Sorry, Justin, you didn't even have anything to say.
The one thing you guys should take is the STIP projects, the names actually have to match in the IGA too. So if you change your limits or if you change any of the other items in there where your name ends up changing, the STIP name and the IGA name has to change. So then you have to do another IGA amendment just to change the name. Now, if that happens with an older project, you are now updating ADA language. You're going to be updating any of the new federal language that's in there. So it's not a quick IGA. It becomes a full-blown amendment.
So something to think about, but talk to your region agreement writers about whether you think you need an amendment. So, and then, yeah, and if, you know.
I had a quick lesson learned that we've encountered coming from the state perspective. When you're working with a local agency, one issue that we've encountered is cash flow. So they may have funds that they're going to say they're available, that they want to commit to, but the funds aren't available now. They're available next year or the following year because it's through their budget cycle. That's delayed projects. The other piece is, as Jeff Flower said Monday, that you can't open that EA until that IGA has been amended. I've had instances where I've had consultants, we have gone through the entire process and we're waiting for NTP, but we can't issue NTP because that IGA hasn't been executed. When you run into situations like that, work with your STIP coordinator so they can work through headquarters and Jeff Flowers to see if they're willing to allow an exception. But the standard rule has been no EA, no NTP until that IGA has been executed.
Reem has a question. I don't know if
Okay,
we have time.
this is our last question.
So I have a couple of questions for you. Quick one.
We'll see if we have
I
time.
promise. I promise. So yeah, the ROSA, which is the right-of-way agreement, it's a template itself.
Yes.
So can you speak a little bit more about it?
Yeah,
Explain
I
to
could speak a
everyone.
little bit. A right-of-way services agreement, anytime that ODOT right-of-way is going to be involved in a project, even if it's just reviewing and signing off on certification, for like a local project, for example, we do a separate right-of-way services agreement that'll cover their costs. You know, in Region 1, we have our right-of-way agents do them because the template is so locked down that there's really, you fill in a couple of boxes, and I don't like to deal with right-of-way. There's too many legal implications with property rights and stuff. I don't like to deal with them. So they do that agreement, and then once they get the reviews and everything, it's a similar process. They send it through Salem, right-of-way, and DOJ if they need to. And then they'll send it to me so I can send it for signature. So that's how Region 1 does it. We help them because we kind of already know who to send it to. We know how that works. I think other regions, Region 2, I think, does their ROUSes themselves as well, like any other agreement. They get those in. They work with their right-of-way agent to fill in all the blanks. But that is something that's needed if ODOT right-of-way is going to be involved at all. And I don't want to speak too much about all of the times they're required because I'm not 100% sure. I just let them come to me and I will ship them off and get them done. But
The last question is the IGA, the project IGA and the maintenance IGA as well. Sometimes we have a regional for signal maintenance, which is separate.
yes. So real quick, on maintenance agreements, they're great. We're getting a lot more of those too, because at least in the city of Portland, we still rely on an agreement from 1944 for a lot of our maintenance. If we don't have another agreement that's newer than that. So we have been doing a lot more of those. City of Portland's for city streets routed over, or state highways routed over city streets. It's not across the board. But so if you have a project, sometimes with our umbrella IGAs, we can we can put in maintenance agreements in that project IGA. And we'll be able to find it later because the project name is in there. So in the future, we're like, who's responsible for the signal at 136? So when we search it, we'll find that project agreement, and usually they'll say in there, ODOT and the local split maintenance 50-50, whatever that is. Sometimes though, we'll come across a situation where you don't know who's going to maintain it or something new that came in, but we didn't need an agreement earlier. And so we can do a standalone maintenance agreement. It could be, and so we'll work with you on the language that we need to cover for who's going to maintain what and what does that entail. So we work with our maintenance folks at the district, and we're also working on more umbrella, like, you know, every signal in the city, but those can be really hard to do. So Sometimes we just need a one-off, like we need a maintenance agreement for this bridge or this overpass, and so we'll work on that. That'll come through agreement section as well. So if you have those needs, also go to your agreement writer. So thanks, Reem. That was a great question.
Ula, thank you so much. Great information, great slides. Justin, thank you.